Hey there. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Pop Culture Coram podcast. I just wanted to give you a heads up about some bonus content on this one. If you are a theology nerd like Jared and I, you'll want to hang around after the final theme song plays because Jared and I get into an extended discussion about his doctoral work and specifically the subject of whether or not human desires can be sinful or if only overt actions are sinful. Anyway, just a heads up. Thanks again for listening. Let's get started on this episode. Hey there, Pop Culture Coram Deo, episode 45, Avengers Endgame. Jared Moore, Jeff Wright here with you, ready to talk about, I don't know, man, the most anticipated movie of the decade. Is that going too far?
Oh, wow. Maybe.
You know, basically, Jared, I think the only thing in the world of pop culture that is more anticipated than Avengers Endgame is episode 45 of the Pop Culture Coram Deo podcast.
Yeah, I think you're right, man. I think you're right.
So, Jared, it's been a minute since we talked. I know you've been hard at work on multiple projects. What's been going on with you, bud?
To pick up where we left off on the last episode, man, I finally got my yard mowed. But I remember making fun of you quite a bit because you had a bad day with the mower. I don't believe in karma, but I believe in reaping what you sow. And so I had my mower wouldn't start. So I changed the solenoid, changed the starter. I didn't think it was the battery because I got a new battery last season. And so I took all that stuff off, banged up my hands, put it all back on. It wouldn't start. So I replaced the battery and it fired right up.
Oh, no.
So
oh, no.
It took me hours and hours and hours and hours. But anyway.
Well, I won't return evil for evil. I'm just so sorry, brother. I've been there.
Oh, me. Yeah, my neighbor did come over, though, and mow my front yard because it was a jungle, which was nice.
Yeah, way to go, neighbor. They might have been protecting their own property values.
Probably.
That's not so much an issue where I live.
Oh, me.
Yeah, I'll give you a pro tip. And again, riveting podcasting here. Get you a battery tender. Get on Amazon and say battery tender. And in the search bar, get you one of those bad boys, plug it in, slap it on your mower over the winter, and she'll take care of you. Some of the best money I've ever spent.
Oh, dude, I need to do that. I didn't know such thing existed.
Yeah, man, they're great.
People told me to unhook it and set it off for the winter.
No, that's true. You can do that, but I think that's even riskier than just hooking up the battery tender.
Okay.
So, yeah, there's your pro tip for home maintenance here from Pop Culture Coram Deo, folks.
What's
this is
this
what you tuned in
speak
for.
Of?
Do what?
Battery tender.
Battery tender. Good stuff.
Okay. It tends to your battery?
Yep, it's right there in the name.
Okay.
I, too, finally got my yard mowed. Hallelujah. What about your dissertation, man? Are you a doctor yet?
Not yet, man. I am on chapter 2, and I believe there are 8 chapters in this bad boy.
I know for sure that I'm speaking on behalf of all our loyal listeners when I say that we're excited for the work you're doing, looking forward to hearing about its completion and seeing how it profits the church.
I appreciate it. Pray for me, folks, to persevere.
Absolutely. Well, man, it's time for our first segment.
What you watching? What you watching? What you watching?
And that means, Jared, I got to ask you.
Sure.
What you been watching?
I watched October Sky a couple days ago, and it is the story of, I can't think of the fella's name, but it's Gyllenhaal, Jake Gyllenhaal, I think is how you say his name.
Yeah, is the guy's name Homer or something?
Yeah, Homer Hinch or...
Okay, it's some famous scientist, right?
Yeah, he's a rocket scientist with NASA, I believe. But when he was growing up in a coal mining town in West Virginia, it's just a story of how he came to love rockets. You know, Russia had Sputnik, and that I believe that was a satellite, if I'm not mistaken. But he sees that, and it just amazes him. And in that town, basically everybody, they knew growing up that they were going to work in the coal mine.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to do that. His dad was kind of running the coal mine. And
wait, this is the plot of Zoolander too.
Yeah, I wonder if Zoolander's actually based some on this. Like, it's funny that you bring that up because whenever I was watching him, Gyllenhaal in the coal mine, it reminded me of Ben Stiller throwing that little bitty piece of coal in the, he's worked real hard and he throws a little piece of coal in the bucket or whatever.
I think I got the black lung, Pop.
October Sky is a good movie, and I think you'll like it. You'll like it. It's rated PG. It's worth seeing.
I think I did watch that back in the day. That's what Homer Hickam.
Yeah, that's right.
No, Homer Hickam. Maybe that's the guy from the Iron Giant. I got to look this up. You keep talking. I got to look this up. It is Homer Hickam. Homer Hadley Hickam Jr. I guarantee you that his dad was a Southern Baptist. You don't alliterate your child's name with a 3-point alliteration like Homer Hadley Hickam if you're not a Southern Baptist.
Triple H. That's who that is.
Oh, this is the original game. That's great. You don't want to play him. That's exactly right. That's hilarious. Yeah, I do remember that being a good movie. I appreciate you bringing that up. That's the kind of thing that, that's the kind of movie that I could bring into my kids' life. You know what I mean? Like stuff from the past that I maybe have forgotten a little bit, but that our kids could, I don't know, maybe could spark their own imagination about what's possible.
Oh, yeah. I've got a buddy that I think he's designing like anti-missile defense for the U.S. military now. I think in part because he watched that movie growing up. He got really interested in rockets after that.
Yeah, I know the guy you're talking about. And the last time we had some kind of get-together that he was going to be invited to, we had to schedule an appointment to call him. So
that's funny.
He's off doing crazy stuff.
He is, and what's so funny, we grew up together, man, and he would be like, hey, how do you spell truck when we were little? Yeah,
that guy, his brain was made for math and engineering, right?
Yeah, I made so much fun of it, but he was brilliant on on math and just how stuff works, man. Just so funny.
Yeah. And listener, when I say we had to make an appointment to call him, it meant we had to call some government line and talk to some officious woman who said, we're not sure if that can happen, but we'll get back to you. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, we hear that he can talk at this very particular time. So crazy stuff, man.
They're probably listening to our podcast.
Yes. Hello, government overlords. Thank you for tuning in. Tell our friend that you know who we're talking about. Tell him we said hello.
Oh, dude, if they're monitoring citizens, they're monitoring you, Jeff.
That's probably true. Yeah, that's probably true. And they are monitoring citizens. See, I did it again.
You are Ron Swanson.
100%. So I think we mentioned this last time. Another thing that I'm really watching is with my wife, Netflix's The Umbrella Academy. Mm-hmm. Which was good in the early episodes, enough that I would keep watching it. But episodes 6, 7, and 8 have been really good. Then there's 2 left in the season we've not watched. But by the time you hit 6, 7, and 8, it's a really compelling story. I'm trying to think if there's anything objectionable in there. I'm sure there's definitely language and there's violence. There's people who shoot and kill and whatnot. I don't think there's any kind of gratuitous sex or sex scenes or nudity. But anyway, that's on when I'm watching TV with the wife right now. And then the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and for those of you listening here who also listen to our Sports Coram Deo episodes, on our most recent one, I said that the NBA Finals is really going to play out in the second round of the Western Conference Finals, and we're there. So Washington, what am I saying? The Golden State Warriors and the Houston Rockets are playing. Game 1 was, neck and neck, and then a lot of controversy. It's kind of driven the news cycle since then about the crisis we're in with reffing, and anyway, pretty compelling stuff. It's pretty high theater for sports, and I'm enjoying it. You watch any sports nowadays, Jared?
I haven't been, but I'm going to try to pick up the playoffs since it's in the second round now. And I did watch 2 more episodes of The Twilight Zone.
Yeah, slapped my wrist. I haven't kept up with that because that's a show I would watch with my wife, but she's wanted to watch Umbrella Academy. So, I mean, is it holding form? You think it's still quality?
Yeah, I do. It is quality, but it's aggravating. Like, there's an overtly, number 3 that's an emphasis on racism, and kind of the unavoidable. Like as long as we're in this world, there's going to be this type of racism, and I don't know. It's very pessimistic, but it's similar to the woke stuff that we expected from Jordan Peele. The episode 3 is, I think, kind of that mentality, like always stay woke type thing. Yeah. But it's worth. I mean, even when I disagree with his premises or his worldview, it's still, he's a good storyteller, and I'm enjoying Twilight Zone.
Oh, good. I'm looking forward to getting back to it. I have the same suspicions about the political underpinnings, but if the story's good enough, I'm used to watching stuff that I know I disagree with ideologically. Mm-hmm. So I know how to how to screen that. And man, Jordan Peele can tell a story. So.
Oh, yeah.
I do think I owe you an apology on that. I think you mentioned that Disaster at 20,000 Feet or whatever the second episode was. Mm-hmm. You said that you thought that was part of the original Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
And I think I told you I didn't think so. You were right.
All right.
So add that to your pile of times Jeff has acknowledged that you're right and he's wrong.
There's not many. I can't count on one hand, but my one hand's almost full now, I think. So.
Almost full, and that's only because you're a gracious forgetter. So
I do not have a good memory at all. But hey, one other thing I'm wanting to try, and I don't know anything about it other than the previews, but this new Netflix series called Chambers. Mm-hmm. You seen previews for it?
Yeah, man. They that's the first thing that spills why. You know, when you pull up Netflix, some time ago they made the change where you can't stop the previews from automatically playing. Mm-hmm. And Chambers is very much the one that shows up first for me.
Yeah, so I'm wanting to try that out and just see. It reminds me of the old scary movies. I can't think of the name of it, but it's something I couldn't recommend, but something I watched as a kid. I don't know if it was it called Body Parts or basically the same premise. And so that's actually why I'm hesitant to watch it, because that's kind of what's in the back of my mind of like, if you got a part from someone, you're going to start doing what they did, or you're going to see what they saw type thing.
Yeah.
And it was a serial killer, I think. And so,
yeah, I think was it Eyes maybe?
Oh, I
can't remember what the movie was. I remember a movie where like Eyes, I think, came from a killer. But anyway, this is Uma Thurman is the one making. She's the creative mind behind Chambers, and I've seen people liken it to Stranger Things. I'm not going to subject it to that comparison. You know what I mean? Like that every kid coming up through the basketball grapevine being compared to LeBron James is having a disservice done to them, and so I'm not going to compare the series to that. But I'm definitely interested in a show that is dealing with those kind of themes. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you this too. So I know our listeners obviously listen to podcasts. A podcast that I'm into and listening to a lot lately is called Peer a Normal. Mm-hmm. And so these guys, and there's one woman involved as a host too. They look at what we would call paranormal phenomenon, mm-hmm. but they only do it through peer-reviewed research. And so there's the peer and the peer normal. And one of our favorites, Brian Godawa, is a regular co-host on this podcast. Cool. And they talk about some fascinating stuff. Some of it I don't have any ability to evaluate. It's just interesting to listen to them as they pull it up from, again, peer-reviewed research. But they did an episode I just saw on my feed that I've not listened to yet on sort of the phenomenon of people who have been organ recipients adopting traits from the donor. And so if you want to look at some of that in real life with some very thoughtful Christians using the best data we have access to in terms of scientific inquiry, check out Paranormal.
Dude, that is some weird stuff. Like, what did they tie it to muscle memory somehow, or?
I don't know. I just saw I saw the description of the episode in the feed, and I've downloaded it, but I've not listened. The one I've been listening to right now is about this, I guess you call it a drug called DMT that people take through ayahuasca, which is this brew that makes DMT more digestible by the human physiology. And these people are reporting reproducible interactions with intelligent beings under the DMT state, and they're reporting you might say, well, that's just a hallucination because they're under the influence of a mind-altering substance, but there's some indication that these interactions are happening across multiple people, and it's pretty wild. It's pretty surreal. And so I'm sitting there listening to it going, man, are people meeting up with demonic entities through this drug? And it's interesting stuff. Again, I don't have the ability to evaluate a lot of it because it's not anything I have an expertise in, but it is fascinating to listen.
That's strange, man. And hey, spell that. Can you spell that?
Peernormal. Peer-a-normal. I think actually, no, I can't because I think I left an A out of it. So Peeranomaral. Peer-a-normal.
You left an R out.
Oh my gosh.
You're doing
Jared,
great.
I can't spell it. Don't ask me to.
Hey, you're my other buddy who can't spell.
Apparently.
You made like a 30-something on your ACT, right?
I made enough to get into college. That's all.
You're really good at reading.
Yeah, really great at reproducing what I read too, obviously. In all seriousness, no, though, Paranormal is well worth a listen, I think.
Oh, I'm going to subscribe to the thing. I've been listening to Aaron Mahnke's Cabinet of Curiosity.
I didn't know that existed.
It's really cool. And if we got any preachers listening, check out Aaron Mahnke's Cabinet of Curiosity. It's like 4 or 5 minute stories, but I'd like to get somebody to transcribe them. And as far as using a sermon illustration here and there, it's just historical oddities. It's really interesting.
Okay.
Like one of them was a bare knuckle guy that was a boxer, back in the day, and he would travel and stand up on stage and say, no man in this room can beat me. But one time someone knocked him out, and it was a woman. It's just fascinating.
Ew, that is interesting. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll
she
check that one
boxed
out
him.
too, because that's what I need. I need more podcasts to listen to.
You need to start more podcasts.
Shut up. Whatever. Yeah. All right. So, Cabinet of Curiosity, we're there, and Paranormal, we're going to sign up, right, guys? All right. You heard the listeners. They're going to sign up.
Oh, dude, these guys are famous. Paranormal. 127 ratings. Good land.
Good land. I think I've never heard that expression before. You just invented it. Yeah.
Dude,
worth listening to.
They do an episode like every 3 months.
Well, it's because they listen to it sometimes. They will post all the peer-reviewed research they're going to read before they talk about it. That's why it takes forever.
Wow. That is cool. These guys are awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I've listened to the episode on the origins of Samhain and Halloween. They've got some, this is crazy. I get it. People are going to roll their eyes, but they've got some really interesting stuff on Sasquatch. So...
Cool.
Yeah. Again, no endorsement, no conclusions, just an interesting enterprise. But on that somewhat conspiratorial note, I will bring this segment to an end. And that means, Jared, it is time for our rapid-fire opinion piece known as...
So sorry to interrupt.
So, Jared, on So Sorry to Interrupt, I got a few things I want to throw at you.
Sure.
The first one, and it all really centers on this, is a recent tragedy. Sadly, we live in a world where it seems like a mass shooting takes place every other day, but the recent days have brought us a situation where a 19-year-old man went into a Jewish synagogue in Poway, California, I think is how you say that, and on the Saturday where they were celebrating the last day of Passover, he opened fire. He killed one woman and wounded 3. The victim was Lori Gilbert Kay, and she was 60 years old. She died, and everybody being wounded is enough of a tragedy, but the fact that a woman lost her life just takes us to another level. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's been, particularly disturbing, if I can say it that way, is that the suspect named John Ernest, that 19-year-old shooter, or at least alleged shooter, although it seems pretty clear it was him, that he grew up in an OPC congregation where his family was very involved, and obviously the OPC there is it's connected to the Reformed tradition that you and I both see ourselves as part of. And so there is, it just feels a little bit more immediate. As a guy who pastors a church that self-consciously tries to profit from the Reformed tradition, you look out on your pews and you realize that there's no ideology, not even the gospel of Christ, that completely insulates wickedness from harming people. And so I just thought we would talk about that for a second. I know you drew my attention to a tweet from a gentleman I was unfamiliar with. What's his name?
I think it's Mika Edmondson.
Yeah, that's the guy. Yeah. And, who neither one of us knows.
Right, we don't know him. I just saw the tweet, and he said he was mourning the loss of Lori Gilbert Kay, 60-year-old mother killed while shielding her rabbi at Chabad Synagogue. Is that how you say it?
I think that's correct.
Synagogue yesterday. I was horrified to learn that her murderer is a member of the OPC, brainwashed by white nationalism in the very midst of a Reformed congregation.
Yeah.
And, I agree. We need to mourn the loss. It's evil. It's wicked. If someone in my congregation did something like that, I would examine what we teach, make sure that we are very clear concerning the gospel and its implications and the truthfulness of Scripture and the value of all humanity. And, and we would repudiate this behavior. But I disagreed with this, Mr. Edmondson. in his terminology, brainwashed by white nationalism in the very midst of a Reformed congregation. If someone in your church does something and it's the opposite of what you've been teaching and what the church has stood on and the confessional standards, right, that the church holds to, I have a hard time. I don't think I wouldn't even mention the church. I mean, I can name you numerous individuals that have done horrible things that were part of churches. That doesn't mean that the church has taught them those things or anything like that. And I don't think this fellow's necessarily saying that, but he seems to be indicating that that the church should have somehow done something different to where this brainwashing wouldn't happen or didn't happen.
Yeah, I saw that as a very weird way to frame the tweet as well. Again, the way that I led us into this is by saying that there's no ideology that can protect someone from believing wicked things and acting on them. It did strike me as odd that he talked about in the midst of the congregation. And to his credit, that Mika gentleman, he kind of walked that back pretty hard in subsequent tweets, right?
He did, yeah, and he praised the church and praised the pastor, and but again, folks are retweeting his tweets.
Oh, sure, they don't always get the retractions and the clarifications.
Yeah, I don't know. We're at a point now where there's a lot of there's a lot of emphasis, and I understand somewhat I understand a lot of the history of the OPC. The Presbyterians in the Jim Crow era were some of the last to come out behind the so-called spirituality of the church.
The spirituality of the church, just so our listeners on the same page, being a doctrinal construct that, I think there is a spirituality of the church.
Right.
The construction was used by racists.
Yes.
Or those who didn't want to take a active position on racism.
Right.
As sort of a shield to keep them out of doing anything about the injustice of racism.
Right. That's exactly right. And the Baptists we were late to the game too, but we repented before the Presbyterians did, and I think
for us. No, that's not what we're saying.
It's not a score for us at all.
It's just the historical chronology.
Facts, yeah. But this fellow though, he's probably aware of that history, right? Mm-hmm. And who knows? It may still be, trickling down in some of our groups in the OPC. I'm not a part of the OPC, but it may be something that some still struggle with as far as a hard view of two kingdom theology, kind of where the church and state are so. The two kingdoms are so separate, if you will, or so distinct that we are primarily concerned with the spirituality of the church instead of the good of our neighbor as well, and justice overarching. But I don't want to caricature either. Those I disagree with on those issues. But I think even the two kingdom guys would come out and say that the OPC was wrong in the past on those issues.
Sure.
So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I really tell you the overarching conclusion I came to is something that everybody's aware of, but I feel like so few of us are actually doing anything with. And it's just the idea that social media is inadequate to talk about certain things. So this gentleman who tweeted the tweet we're talking about, he ended him talking about this tragedy with these two emojis. And they were crying face emojis, but it seems so trivial and trite to put on a message expressing devastation over the loss of a human life. And I get it. Like that's the grammar of social media. That's how those platforms encourage us to talk about things. And I just realized, like, man, social media is just not the right mechanism for this. It, by its nature, is too superficial. I already said trite, but too trite to really effectively deliver meaningful communication. And I don't know what to do about social media. I'm not the only person in the world who's freaked out about it. I think it's fine to communicate information like news and offer pieces to think through. We promote our episodes and whatnot through social media, but I really don't know that Twitter, Facebook even, which is longer form, I just think those aren't the places to have have meaningful conversation about the most important matters of life on earth. I will tell you this. I started talking to our church a couple of years ago, thinking about the danger that online ideology has, particularly to young men in our community, and the way that it affords this opportunity to come under the influence of some crazy stuff that, apart from the internet, would have not been available. And I started talking to my church on Sundays before we began corporate worship about families worshiping together, children worshiping with adults, cross-generational fellowship, why that's so important. And I've been trying to encourage people that part of what we're doing as a church body and on Sunday mornings is that we're helping to inform what people mean when they say the word we. I want the kids who gather up at Midway Baptist Church and the adults, when they think about their group identity, the first identity I want them to think of is the church. And by that I mean the people who are Jesus's, so that these racist and, sometimes nationalism gets lumped in with that. I don't think nationalism is always the worst thing in the world in the way that racism is, but these racist and nationalist ideologies compete, I think, with the church for that space in the category of we. And I want our church to be really careful about filling that category out well. I don't think this shooter's church did it any worse than we do at mine. It's just that we started talking about it more during the rise of what they call the alt-right. I don't even know. The alt-right has never issued a platform, or, we don't really know how to define that group even now, but that's the heading this stuff goes under. And I really think, preach against racism every time the text tells you to. Promote a view of, the universal dignity of mankind under the image of God, and that, that we have a common ancestor in Adam and in Noah, so that the idea of like different races is not particularly consistent with a Christian worldview. I think those are some things that are needful and helpful to do. But to get back to where I started at, I don't think there's any magic bullet that keeps a guy growing up in the midst of a gospel preaching congregation from embracing wickedness and acting on that. That's not a resource that God has given to the children of men.
Right. I mean, it's you hold the church accountable for what they teach and how they live. And if they have been encouraging white supremacy, then they need to be disciplined in the OPC, right? But if not, I don't think that the church's congregation should have even been mentioned. Like, I don't see the point of mentioning that. This is a wicked person,
acting inconsistently with
what he's been taught,
the
right?
community that's under evaluation here.
Yeah. And I mean, just as a pastor, thinking through the churches I've pastored, now no one that I'm aware of has done anything like this. But I mean, there have been heinous sins, and contrary to what is taught and what we emphasize, right? And to think that the Lord may hold me accountable for what someone else has done, even though we've taught contrary to that just does not. And not to mention, I mean, if you look at you look at Judas, for example, spent 3.5 years with Jesus,
sure,
sat under his teaching, and lost as lost can be the whole time, and ended up betraying God the Son incarnate. I mean, good grief. I don't know if there's a worse act in human history. I guess those who nailed him to the cross.
It's hard to make a comparison between the two in terms of wickedness.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, but anyway, and there's numerous examples in Scripture of folks who departed what was taught, what was the good that was taught, and so anyway, I think we need to be more careful on social media in the gravity of things. I think praying for people is what we should emphasize. But two, tragedies are not a time to take a shot. And I view this tweet as a time to take a shot at the OPC or at white nationalism but mentioning those two together like that, I just don't think is helpful. And I think we need to be more careful in capitalizing on tragedies. I mean, I've seen it with it's similar with John Chow, I think, or John Cho, the missionary who, I can't remember what islands, it was islands near India where he was trying to share the gospel with headhunters. Well, people jumped on, Christians that Southern Baptists even jumped on and started talking about colonialism within a few days of him being martyred. And that's just not to use a. To use another man giving his life while we're sitting on our comfortable chairs tweeting, there's something wrong with that.
Sure. And again, I'm just going to suggest that social media, it just is not the place to be doing this stuff. I realize people are going to keep doing it, but I don't think the form itself is conducive to having substantial exchange of ideas. Mm-hmm. Last thing, just before we go, I don't think I've heard anything from the church that this young man attended, but we have heard a statement from the family, and it came out fairly close to the news of the shooting. They said that they are shocked and deeply saddened by the terrible attacks on the synagogue. Speaking of their child, he has killed and injured the faithful who were gathered in a sacred place on a sacred day. And then they also said, our son's actions were informed by people we do not know and ideas that we do not hold. My heart breaks for that family. To watch your loved one become a monster and know that it crept up unawares and is entirely contradictory to the values of your family and your faith. It's just shattering. And so, obviously the biggest tragedy is the loss of life and the people who are hurt, but there's a family out there hurting pretty badly. And, I guess we live in a day that wants us to think that saying thoughts and prayers are bunk, and I'm with them on thoughts, but I definitely feel like prayer is the best thing we can offer from a distance to this family, and I would encourage everybody listening to say a prayer for their consolation in Christ.
Mm-hmm. Amen. And pray for the Did the shooter, did he pass, or is he?
No, he is under custody. He's held in custody, so he will face justice in a courtroom, and that's a good thing. So often these people kill themselves or are killed in the standoff with the police that results, and I think this guy's going to have to give an accounting of what he's done.
Let's pray for his repentance.
Man, that's a morbid topic. You got anything you want to talk about on So Sorry to Interrupt?
I don't, man. I sure don't. I'm ready for Endgame.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's just go ahead and shift gears then. So do that as quickly as we can mentally, coming off such a weighty topic. And let's pull the curtain on Endgame. So, Jared, you and I watched this one together on opening night. We saw the 7 o'clock showing in Cookeville, Tennessee, and boy, howdy, was it packed. The only comparable situation I've been in, ironically enough, was the debut of Infinity War. Did you make opening night on that one?
Yeah, you and I went together.
Oh, sorry, I forgot, man. I have a terrible memory. I remember the parking lot was full for Infinity War, but it was just the movie theater parking lot for Infinity War. It was the business on the side filled up too. You got to the theater before me, and you said, hey man, you better park in this other business's parking lot. And by the time we got out of the theater, I don't think I saw very many open spaces in that auxiliary location. I'm sure our listeners know the deal with our process here. We talk about the premise of the movie, and once we're done kind of giving a summary of the premise, we're in full-blown spoiler territory. So I'm just about to tell Jared the IMDb summary of the movie, and when it is over, we will be in spoiler territory. So if you don't want to have the movie ruined for you, press pause, go check it out, come back, and we'll finish the episode with you when you get back. But anyway, Jared, let me give you the IMDb synopsis, and you tell me what it got wrong.
Okay.
After the devastating events of Avengers Infinity War from 2018, the universe is in ruins. With the help of remaining allies, the Avengers assemble once more in order to undo Thanos' actions and restore order to the universe. And I don't know why I said Thanos instead of Thanos.
That sounds good, man.
All right. Spoiler territory then, guys. Jared, we also talk about conscience warnings for thoughtful Christians who may find content in these films we review troubling. What would you highlight as conscience issues in this movie, potentially?
There's quite a bit of language. It makes light of drunkenness. Those are the two main things, and then there's violence all over the place.
Yeah. One thing that stood out to me was an early scene where we realize that the Avengers don't have the resources to bring the people who were snapped out of existence back. So we're 5 years in, and Captain America is leading group therapy for some survivors, and they're talking about how to press on with their lives. And there's this gentleman talking about how, it's been difficult, but he went on a date, and eventually it comes out that the date this gentleman went on was with another gentleman, and it kind of ends, the discussion he raises there kind of ends on the note that we're going to go out again. And Captain America says something to the effect of good for you.
Mm-hmm.
And, anyway, I was troubled by it. It made me think about, my kids are going to see this movie at some point. How do I talk to them about the movie? And how do I help them think through that? I think it rightly would trouble a thoughtful Christian to see that kind of specific rebellion highlighted and have Captain America endorse it.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I think that's all on that.
Yeah. What you said about language is for sure. Like, there was a running joke early on in these movies where Captain America, as a product of an earlier time, product of the greatest generation, he would sort of scold or chide the other Avengers for using foul language. And that lid was completely taken off in this one. Specifically with him, like several different times he's using foul language. And I was kind of struck by that. I wish that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. He's supposed to be the most virtuous one, right? And then he's encouraging the gay guy at the beginning, and then, like you said, using language, and it's just odd backward a little bit.
For sure. But despite those concerns and reservations we have just walked through, man, the American audience and actually the global audience has responded to Endgames in literally record-shattering numbers. At this point, I think the movie, in its first weekend, so we're recording after the first weekend, the movie has made over $1 billion globally. It has shattered like Thursday preview records and opening night records and opening weekend records. And I think I told you on the way out, this was no sign of predictive prophecy in my life, but I told you I will not be surprised at all if this becomes the highest grossing movie. And you said kind of the same thing. You said, yeah, even in the like adjusted for inflation sense, it's going to, I think you compared it to The Exorcist.
Yeah.
And, clearly this thing is going to destroy any of those records. Anything that, before we get into the actual analysis, anything that's particularly delighted you about this movie?
I mean, I enjoyed almost everything about it, man. I mean, it is a great movie. I mean, as far as, and we can get into that, what's where I see myself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just jump right into our analysis. So we're going to compare this movie against the story that God is telling about his son, Jesus Christ. And that happens in 4 acts. Creation. God creates all things good. Fall. Sees his creation choose the path of rebellion, and in that rebellion provoke his wrath, resulting in death. But he remains committed to his purposes, and so he sends his son as the perfect agent of redemption to undo the curse of sin and to satisfy his wrath against creation's rebellion, ultimately resulting in a glorified new world. We take a look and see what the better world will be now that redemption has come. So, Jared, with that in mind, what do you see as creational goodness in this film?
It's kind of a post-apocalyptic world, right? I mean, families are in turmoil. It seems the economy and businesses and homes and just everything's kind of in turmoil. The world is still not the same. It's not for the better, which is what Thanos wanted, right? And what he assumed that it would be for the better. And, by the way, I thought it was interesting that they didn't try to play it out like it was better, even for the environment. I mean, there was just one casual thing.
And I think they mentioned a whale pod in the Hudson.
Yes, yeah, they did. That it was there were fewer ships, so it was cleaner water. But other than that, I didn't notice any overt positive thing about half of everything being gone, which surprised me, I guess. But it's today's world. If half of everything was gone, so there is good, there is evil. Good folks should fight evil, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In that way, it is a movie that's built on, I guess we would say, common law. Like, this movie understands that death is a bad thing and that powerful people choosing who lives and who dies by arbitrary means, that's a tragedy, not something to be celebrated. Which, really is, as crazy as it sounds, I'm thankful for, because I feel like just that idea that death is something to be upset about and mourn is radically cast off in our day. We hear this nonsense about how life is just this circle and that death is every bit a part of it as much as birth is, and it's all just quasi-new age, self-help, self-consolation nonsense. Death is an enemy. It is to be despised weaponized, and thankfully Christ has destroyed it and is working out the implications of that destruction. But I don't know, in some ways it's refreshing to have a movie set in front of you that says, oh yeah, death is a tragedy. We're not going to pretend like it's a natural feature of life. It was interesting to me. So I've seen the movie twice. How many times have you seen it?
Just once.
Okay, so both times I was in a theater that was packed out. One was opening night. The second was Friday night, and full of people who felt very comfortable responding to the screen. And particularly in the showing you and I went to, when we see the Avengers locate, this happens very early on in the film, the Avengers locate the planet that Thanos is hiding out on. They head up there to try to wrest the Infinity Gauntlet from him. They realize he's destroyed the thing, and then Thor executes him, walks out of the cabin that Thanos was living in, and the screen goes black, and successively 3 words appear on the screen in white text. It's just 5 years later. There was a loud and audible gasp in the theater we were in. I found that interesting. It does a good job of taking the wind out of your sails. If you thought like, oh no, the movie will open by them trying to restore everybody, they say, yeah, they did try that and it didn't work, and so they've had to live for 5 years, and it does feel like a punch in the stomach. Built, of course, as I've been mentioning, all on the idea that death is a tragedy. Well, so if that is creational goodness, Jared, what do you see as fallenness in this movie?
I think fallen is, we experienced it. We experienced it last movie. It's when half the population or half of creation's gone, and it's not reversed. But in this movie, not only that, it's if they don't attempt. Like I think at the beginning, Stark is fallen. He's living he's being selfish. He's got he's got his family, so he's not going to try to save other people's families.
Gotcha.
And so I think that's in there as well as what. So it's when the bad guy wins is fall, but also when the good guys are selfish, I guess.
Yeah.
And Thor's being selfish too.
Yeah. There's a lot of, it's weird to say it for a superhero movie, but there's a lot of realistic coping mechanisms that come out with the various figures. They're super powered gods among men type, but nonetheless, they're responding to tragedy the way that you see people respond in real life. And so no surprise, Tony Stark came out with a good hand, and he's going to lean into that and try to build a better future with the things he's been given. But Thor starts self-medicating with alcohol and food and isolation. Natty, Natalia, who's the Scarlet Witch, she's trying to respond to a world out of control by exercising as much control as she can, keeping people coordinated and running missions. Who else? I guess the big character who responds terribly is Hawkeye, who becomes Ronin and is on a one-man killing spree, fighting various forms of organized crime around the world in the most brutal fashion possible. And he's lashing out in anger that these people remain when his family was taken from him. Any other reactions that I'm not capturing?
No, I think that's it, man.
So redemption, then, where does redemption come through in this film?
Well, when the superheroes are selfless and they get back to, and their coping it's selfish coping, right? It's we lost, and so it's how you deal with losing. And it's true that you'll never get hurt, I guess, if you don't go out there and fight. You'll never lose again, but you also never win. And you don't go out and fight because you're going to win. You go out and fight because it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. And thankfully in this movie, like the real world, the hero of the story, or the heroes, I guess, in terms of this film, sacrificing themselves actually does accomplish something good. It accomplishes a restoration of all things, if you will. So in that sense, Avengers Endgame really tells the truth about the way history works. It's probably pretty obvious, but the glorified new world on the far side of that, I guess in some ways it's not everything that we'd hope for. There's some people who, for whatever reason, have to remain dead, but some come back, and we see one hero die, or actually 2 heroes die to accomplish the victory. Another one, though, he gets to go and get the girl and live the life with his love that he was separated from over time. I'm talking about Captain America. He gets to go have a domestic life with her and live out what we assume is an enjoyable and virtuous life with her in the past. And, of course, all the people snapped out of existence come back. Anything else in the glorified world?
No, I think you nailed it, man. I mean, it was mostly a great ending, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there were several plot holes, I thought, but we can talk about that.
Well, let's do that now. So after we break the world up into those worldview categories of creation, fall, redemption, and glorification, we start trying to put this thing back together through some analysis. And the first question in analysis for us is, what's the story? And we hope to get it right. And normally we let the worldview work handle getting the story right, but there's a lot more here I'd like to highlight. So why don't you talk about those plot holes you saw, Jared?
One is the time stone.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why couldn't, so when Tony is consumed, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the movie, why didn't they just take the time stone and heal him? I mean, what's his name? Thanos destroyed everything and he couldn't heal himself after he had destroyed the stones, but they had the stones again. Why didn't they just heal Tony? Because remember at the end of Infinity War, he, if I'm not mistaken, he gets stabbed, doesn't he, by Thor?
Mm-hmm.
But then he reverses it all with the time stone.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm guessing that the explanation would be that the use of the Infinity Gauntlet had so injured Tony that he couldn't basically activate his will to wind time back. I love this movie. I don't want to spend a ton of time just like taking shots at it, but they are playing fast and loose with some of their own rules. And some of the things that they've done over the 10 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is, it's just contradictory. So like in the first Guardians of the Galaxy, we see that a mortal holding a single Infinity Stone is sufficient to almost, destroy them at the atomic level. But later on, several mortals are just carrying these things around in a satchel until they put them in the gauntlet. So, are these things going to destroy you because they're so powerful? Or can you hand them to one another like marbles? But then by the time we get to Tony, the use of the thing destroys him. And it did something similar to the Hulk. It ate up the Hulk's right arm and chewed up his neck. And so I do think maybe one of the creatives there, one of our listeners even, could tell us, hey, this is how this is consistent. But it sure looks inconsistent.
Yeah. And Black Widow, I don't understand why they couldn't go back. It didn't make sense to me that they couldn't go back and get her. That nothing could be done. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Sure. Even the movie they kind of own that it's arbitrary, and they punt to just that's what the Soul Stone requires.
Yeah.
It's this way because the Soul Stone says it has to be, which isn't particularly satisfying, but I guess it's better than just, the equivalent of saying, well, that's how it is because that's what the script says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also thought it was inconsistent. I don't know if it's a plot hole or what. I don't know if they got pushed back or what, but in the way that Infinity War, the way that the story is told, it seems they want you to consider that maybe Thanos has a good idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want you to be at least somewhat sympathetic towards his position.
Sure.
But throughout the Endgame, there's no way to have a positive view of him or his idea at all. Which I'm glad. I like this better than Infinity War myself. And I really enjoyed Infinity War. I thought it was the second best movie of 2018. But anyway, so I thought that, not that was inconsistent, but that's more of a story. Like, why, if you're going to make him a moral monster, completely make him a moral monster in the second part, why not do that in the first part? Like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why cultivate sympathy for the devil?
Yeah. And then the way that they portray how it actually looks, like, oh, this is kind of a good idea to save the planet. We need to, you hear these crazy arguments from people, right? Like Earth Day was, I think last Monday or a week ago. It was the Monday after Easter, and people were talking about women, what was it, closing their wombs for a day or something? I can't remember.
No joke. I didn't hear that. I'm not aware.
Yeah, it was just silly stuff, man. Like we're eating up the planet or whatever, the baloney that you hear.
Sure.
And then we see Social Security is going to run out of money because we keep we've killed 60 million people who could have paid into that thing.
Right.
But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, some of them I'm sure would have ended up dependent upon social safety nets, but it's just the raw manpower and work production and not to mention the innovation that would come from those people who have been tragically killed off through abortion. It's wild, but yeah, let's close our wombs because less babies is the solution.
Yeah, less babies. It's so crazy. And you see it, what I saw China is like, I don't know how many women short for men. And because, and you think of the sinfulness of mankind. And so men are taking that, and there's all kinds of evil that they're pursuing instead of pursuing marriage. But anyway.
Yep.
It's just evil.
Yeah,
but anyway, I thought that was inconsistent.
Yeah, I think it was inconsistent too. Just on this note, I was considering the reality that we kind of live in a post-Thanos' world anyway. So you mentioned 60 million aborted. The best data I could find about the population of the United States is that we're a people 331 million strong. And I mean, I've already evidenced in this episode I can't spell, but I'm also particularly bad at math. And if you do 60 million aborted out of 331, you're looking at like a solid 20%.
Wow.
So it's not one half that's missing the way it is in Infinity Gauntlet. Sorry, that's the comic book underlying story. Yeah. Endgame, but it's not that far off in terms of just percentages, you know.
Yeah, so we're living in we think we're living in the end of Endgame, but we're living in the beginning.
Sure. It's as if Thanos snapped away 20% rather than 50, at least in our country.
But we didn't know those people, Jeff.
That's true. Well, but remember that's Thanos' plan by the end of the film.
Yeah.
Let's just not let anybody know there was a better world. I mean, he could have been wearing pink and shouting his abortion in that plan.
Wow, that's good. I mean that's a good comparison.
It's stomach turning. You know, we think we're going to watch a movie about some dystopian alternate world of fantastical elements, and I mean I know that 20 is not even half of 50%, but it's disturbingly in the ballpark.
Oh man, it's awful. It's weird. I mean, so evil. It's the great evil today.
Yeah, it's the greatest moral crisis of my lifetime. And, starting in 1970 with a running count, it's the greatest moral crisis of anyone's lifetime from the moment it started. So we're kind of getting ahead, I guess, into some of the dark material or the dark questions this material raises. But the second question we normally ask is, where am I? And we want to see the style and shape of this imaginary world. So, Jared, where are you at when you watch this movie?
I want to be Tony Stark or Captain America, right? I mean, that's who I want to be, but Stark is usually a jerk. But he was particularly good in this one. I mean,
eventually, when he's going off on Cap about Cap not being there when they lost, him not being on the planet fighting Thanos. I was so over Tony Stark in that scene. I just, he led the way in turning Captain America into a criminal, and then he throws down with Cap over this buddy of Captain America's who was brainwashed into killing his family. Like, nobody made a problem here except you, Tony. I read a guy on Film Fisher, which is a website I have recently began writing for. He did an analysis of the MCU, and he said the central conflict in the MCU is basically Tony Stark versus Steve Rogers. And he made the point that for the main Avengers films, Tony Stark's the villain. Like, he's constantly trying to clean up the mess he made. And he's not wrong. The author of that piece was not wrong. And so when Tony is accusing Captain America of lying to him, even talking about the Ultron project that destroyed Sokovia, I was like, Tony, if this is what they're doing with this character in this film, I'm going to be really sad because it's going to make him the most hateful thing in the world. So I'm glad that's not ended up being exactly what they did with the Tony Stark character. But at the beginning there, it was looking iffy. He does become much less selfish, though, thankfully.
Oh yeah. So him and Captain America are the ones I want to identify with, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, even like you pointed out, Captain America is not. I mean, superheroes have their flaws, right? But Captain America has always been the virtuous one, right? But in this one, he's less virtuous. And then the one who's supposedly a god, Thor, good grief, it was it was ridiculous to me when he's still a fall down drunk.
Yeah.
And he's still worthy to carry the hammer or whatever.
Sure. Man, I guess in Distorted and False is the proper time to handle this. But when Thor is talking to his mom again, and she is like showing him the way forward, everything she says there is pleasant sounding nonsense. It's complete empty calories in terms of embracing reality. And seriously, on the second watch, there's so much about this movie I liked even better on the second watch, but watching it the second time and having a chance to really sit down and look at what she's saying, I'm surprised it got through the editors. Like, I think it would have been more believable for her to pull him aside, whisper something in his ear, him smile, and get his mojo back than her telling him that being a hero is a matter of just being the best you that you can be. It's just complete vapor lock nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like you said, yeah, this guy who has abandoned his people, he has failed to live up to the burdens of responsibility that come with being a king. He's a complete train wreck, and literally, like, his people are suffering because there's no leadership. Now, I get it. Valkyrie was making do and whatnot, but you can tell that she's not happy about the way things are when we first meet her. Nonetheless, he's still worthy.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty goofy. I will say this, and a guy from my church texted me this, that we all owe Kevin Feige a debt of great honor because he made it possible for all the husbands out there to slide up next to their wife and say, "You're married to a man with the body of a Norse god."
That's right.
So I guess there was some consolation.
Yeah, when everybody started laughing when they first saw him, I was thinking, what's everybody laughing at, right? Like, this is how I look, my shirt off. Actually, not as good as he looked.
That's hilarious. All right, man. So I'm with you. I'm just, I really resonate with Captain America. He's the North Star in these movies for me, and he's the guy that I'm most rooting for in all these films. And so I'm thankful he's there. Now they undercut in significant ways his virtue in this film, but not enough for me to throw off my appreciation of the character. And I'm just thankful we got a happy ending for him. Well, so Jared, what's good, true, and awesome in this movie? How do we behold common grace?
I thought the emphasis on being unselfish, repentance being displayed. I don't know if Thor ever repented. Maybe he did by the end. Do you think? Maybe he did by the end. Tony definitely did. I like seeing that. I like seeing the flaws of these guys and then them recognizing them and turning from them. And then doing what's right. I mean, that's what we need. That's what we need, more and more men and women like that. So I thought that was really good. I thought the emphasis on, even Hawkeye, I thought he seemed to repent, right? Of the life that he had lived for 5 years, which I guess he was kind of like going Punisher on everybody, is what it looked like.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And he was carrying that guilt around big time. I thought all those were really, really good points. Again, an emphasis on repentance in these movies that I enjoyed and thought was helpful. I thought all the cinematography, I thought the humor was good. Even though Thor was immoral, I thought there were a lot of funny parts. He was funny.
Sure.
And the scenes, like you were talking about, I did not expect the 5 years later part. I thought they kept the timeline pretty good.
Yeah, for a time travel movie, it's pretty solid anyway.
Yeah, how they brought all that together. I thought Hulk was. I did not expect that about Hulk.
Oh yeah.
I did something that was different though. I was wanting to see his repentance. Because he did not. He was the coward in the last movie. He refused to come out and fight.
Yeah. Well, the dominant personality though in this version of the Hulk did, right. He strapped on the Hulkbuster armor and continued to fight.
He did. I wanted something 1-on-1 with him and Thanos though. Kind of a redemption of, like, I thought he would be a major hero in this one because of how big of a coward he was in the last one.
Sure.
Which the Hulk being a coward is odd.
Well, he did snap back everybody everybody into existence, right? That's a pretty big moment of redemption.
It is.
Sorry, it doesn't live up to your standards, Mr. Moore.
I wanted to see him fight Thanos.
Yeah.
But and win, or at least, and it was I did like the Red Witch getting to fight him.
The Red Witch, the Scarlet Witch.
Scarlet Witch, my bad. Is it? I didn't even know. I thought it was Red Witch.
No, it's Scarlet.
Okay, the Scarlet Witch. Forgive me, you comic book head. What is her real name, Jeff? Can you tell us her real name, like in the comic books?
Wanda Maximoff. Come on, man.
Are you serious?
Yeah. That's off the top of my head, dude. That's not even a challenge.
That is impressive. Oh man. But anyway, I like that, and I think there's just a ton of common grace in this. I mean, it's what makes a superhero movie a superhero movie. You know, you can't have a superhero movie without common grace.
Yeah, I think this is the section of the review where it's, geek out time. And this is just such a well-crafted story. Now, I think there are questions, and we'll get to those here in a minute, but they did so much wrapping up the themes that they had sprouted in previous films. I don't know if you remember this. Maybe we talked about it walking out of the theater, but there's a verbal fight between Tony Stark and Steve Rogers on the helicarrier in the first Avengers. Loki has got them on their heels and they're barking at each other.
I have no idea.
Okay, so, I mean, just the argument is basically, what is the measure of a man? And so Tony is running his mouth at Steve, and Steve says, put the armor on and let's go work this out, in a fight, basically. And at one point, he tells Tony, without that suit, what are you? And of course, Tony's got a smart reply. He says, billionaire, inventor, philanthropist. And he tells Steve, everything good about you came out of a bottle.
Oh, wow.
So the idea is that Tony is just an empty suit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Steve is just a science experiment. And I've not read Kevin Feige or the Russo brothers talking about this, but by the time we get to the end of Endgame, both of their criticisms have been diffused. In that fight in the original Avengers, Steve tells Tony, okay, sure, you're this man of science or whatever, but you're not the kind of guy to lay down on a wire and let someone walk across you. And Tony, of course, I think I'd cut the wire. And Steve elaborates and says, you're not the kind to make the sacrifice play. We had seen in the first Avenger that Steve, before he was subjected to the super soldier serum, he dove on what he thought was a live grenade that would have, if it had exploded, it would have killed a bunch of his fellow trainees. He jumped on top of it to save their lives, right? And so he's telling Tony, that's not the person you are. And that's when Tony hits him with the everything special about you came out of a bottle. But the definitive scene in Endgame is Tony laying on the wire and making the sacrifice play. And I really think that represents growth in him, that he had went from a character who was worthy of a lot of criticism, although we got hints of it, right? When he grabs the bomb and flies it up into outer space in the first Avengers, we start to realize that this is a guy who has it within him to be more than just a selfish playboy. But then also by the time Endgame is over, when my favorite part in the whole movie, when Thor picks up Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, and starts using it, the only people...
You mean Steve?
Who did I say? Thor?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, Steve picks up Thor's hammer. That hammer can only be lifted by the one who's worthy. And so what's special about Steve isn't super soldier serum. It's the man he is inside. And his ability to heft the hammer validates that. And so again, by the time I think of that as like the central axis on which all these movies rotate. And I feel like they did such a perfect job wrapping it up by the end of that movie. It was just like, it got dusty in the theater levels of... good. I choked up multiple times, and I choked up worse watching it the second time. Do you remember in the Spider-Man, I can't remember if it's in Homecoming or earlier, but when Tony first takes Spider-Man like on a mission, and afterwards he's dropping him off, and he reaches across Spider-Man, and Spider-Man hugs him, and Tony says, no, not a hug, I'm just opening the door for you. Well, when Peter Parker shows back up in Endgame, he gives Stark a big hug, and not knowing at that point that Stark would die, I thought, that's a sweet callback to that hug. But then knowing that Stark was soon going to die, and it was Peter's, it was losing Peter that really pushed him over the edge to consider trying to reverse what Thanos had did. It got super dusty right there where I was sitting, man.
Yeah, it was good about that. I mean, it was kind of all your emotions in the movie, right?
Absolutely. I just really marvel at what they were able to do narratively in tying up. Again, there's weaknesses. I think somebody pointed out that in the first Guardians movie that Gamora is listed as the last survivor of her species or her people. But I can grant them that stuff. I can grant them that stuff because he's they hit all the big stuff so well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned the Hulk. That happened in the comics. It's called Professor Hulk, where there's actually 3 identities in the comics up until that point. There was the savage Green Hulk, a less strong Gray Hulk who had a bitter sense of humor, and Bruce Banner. And they all combined together to become the Professor. And that's what I was hoping for before the series was over. But I didn't know I'd get it. And I was super pumped to see to see Professor Hulk. That's my favorite version.
That's cool, man. It's just funny that you know all that. That's great.
Oh, I don't think it's particularly great, but I've spent a lot of time reading comic books, and the Easter eggs in this film are just incredible. Let me ask you this: did you notice that the boy that Tony befriends when he's running away from the Mandarin in Iron Man 3? Did you notice that he was there at the funeral? You remember the little boy I'm talking about? Like Tony crash lands in a town in Tennessee. Do you remember that from Iron Man 3?
I don't.
Yeah, so he's trying to flee this attack on his home, and he ends up crash landing in Tennessee. He manages to come in contact with this little boy who gives him access to his dad's old shop.
Oh yeah, I remember.
And I was watching the funeral scene play out where they're floating the wreath out into the waters of the lake, and it's showing all these heroes. I'm like, I know who that is. I know who that is. I know who that is. And I saw a teenager there, and I'm like, who in the world is that? And I reached out to one of my friends, and he's like, that's a little kid grown up from Iron Man 3. I thought that was pretty cool. The actor's name is Ty Simpkins. And apparently Howard the Duck is in this movie at one point too. I totally missed it, but I'm going to go back and look for it when I see it for a third time.
Why?
Do what?
Why is Howard the Duck in it?
He's a Marvel property, and he showed up in the collector's collection in one of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. He might have been part of one of the post-credit scenes, but he's in there, and so I guess he made it to the battlefield to fight Thanos.
That is cool.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. In that big major fight, he's somewhere behind the Wasp at one point. Apparently, you see him step out of the portal. Well, okay. I guess enough geeking out about the movie. What's distorted, evil, and false here? How do we subvert idolatry?
I think it's, I think the virtue, the definition of virtue, like, I don't know, these movies, man, there's never, Captain America was near perfect, right?
Yeah.
But in this movie, he's not. Thor was, close to perfect. They just seem getting further and further away from moral perfection.
Moral uprightness even, right?
Yeah. I mean, what God requires is moral perfection, just perfection, period. And that's what we have in Jesus. That's why we need Christ. We need someone who, going back to my dissertation, we need someone who has a perfect, sinless nature, who has perfect, sinless inclinations, desires, and action. And these men are, they're too sinful. And I think the point is that it's kind of what you do that defines you. And if you do what's right, that's the most important thing, even if you're a drunk.
Or if you eventually do what's right.
Right. Yeah, when it's down to the nitty gritty and you're willing to, that's kind of the best case. But I did not care for that. It seems that superheroes are getting less virtuous. Concerning the start of this thing, Captain America definitely, Thor definitely. Tony has grown though, as you pointed out, and maybe Hulk has grown as well.
Yeah, I do want to counterbalance that. I do think Tony became more virtuous, and I think Scarlett Johansson's character, the Black Widow, I think she became more virtuous. Yeah, she says as much.
She did. I agree with that. One thing I didn't like we haven't even mentioned Captain Marvel.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, Captain Marvel, I don't like I am perfectly fine with strong femininity, but Captain Marvel is trying to do Wonder Woman and in a worse way. In my opinion, like they're they're trying to take traditional, what's been traditionally considered masculinity and trying to blur the lines there with Captain Marvel between women and men. They even give her a real short haircut. And they go out of the way to point it out. There's also a scene where all the women get together.
Yeah.
As I think it's the Scarlet Witch, right?
Yeah, so Captain Marvel is going to make a run with the gauntlet to try to get it away from the battlefield, get it away from Thanos. And so Parker hands it to Captain Marvel and says, how are you going to get through all those bad guys? And then all the women characters kind of rally to her and say, don't worry, she's got a lot of help. Mm-hmm. And in the comics, there's this group called the A-Force. It's basically an all-women Avengers team from 2015, which is, it's okay. Like, it's cool if the women gang up together and go fight stuff. Mm-hmm. But particularly on the heels of Captain Marvel and the stuff that Brie Larson has had to say about women and men and who her movie's for and all that stuff, it's impossible not to see that through the lens of politics. And it doesn't, the political lens does not help the movie.
Right. And the just the feminism, mm-hmm. We can do anything men can do, and we can do anything women can do on top of that. It's just...
Yeah, but none of them are doing traditionally feminine things. They're just doing traditionally masculine things. And it's not like the comics... that comic books can't do this. Sue Richards, who is the wife of Mr. Fantastic in the Fantastic Four, mm-hmm. She's been a character I've always enjoyed, and I've enjoyed Fantastic Four movies because they function as a family, not just in the sense of camaraderie, but Mr. Fantastic and she have children, and they have to think through how do we nurture these children and care for them, but also make use of the gifts that the children are born with. How do we help them control it? And it's a, I don't want to say a unique take on the comic book story, but like it reflects real world dynamics in families, and it's interesting for that reason. Mm-hmm. But when you strip all that away and just say the women are going to act as we traditionally see men act, only they're going to be a little bit better at it, you lose the goodness of masculinity and the goodness of femininity, mm-hmm. which is really frustrating.
It is, and not only that, but there's bumper sticker slogans like questions like, do you have a problem with a strong woman? No, we don't. That's not what we're saying. Do you have a problem with a woman who can beat up a man? No, I mean, we don't have a problem with any of these things. Like we're not. It's not that we're against it. We're just tired of one way to present women. Oh yeah, and Hollywood cannot present. They rarely present. They rarely celebrate true femininity. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, it's constantly trying to prove that women can do anything a man can do. Yeah. I mean, man, I guess this is the point where some of the people listening to the podcast want to scream at it. But I don't think it does service to women to define their worth by making them like traditional men. And there's a couple ways to kind of look at this. Just from a comic book perspective, Captain Marvel is so ridiculously overpowered that she kind of takes the fun out of the conflict. Like, she is much more powerful than Thor, who is always seen as a super heavy hitter in the Marvel Universe. There is this character in the Marvel Universe called the Sentry, who is basically Superman. Mm-hmm. And the Captain Marvel we've seen so far, is light years beyond the Sentry in terms of what their power levels are. Mm-hmm. I really would not have been surprised, and I'm thankful they didn't do it, but I wouldn't have been surprised if Captain Marvel returning to Earth to do battle wasn't the definitive change in the movie, because, again, as soon as she shows up, she takes down all of Thanos' ship just by flying through it. Yeah. And when he punches her, we've watched him knock Thor around, knock the Hulk around, knock Iron Man around, and Captain America around, which those are less impressive than what he did to Thor and Hulk. He goes to punch her, and she stares at him like he did something stupid. Mm-hmm. At that level of power, there's no interesting conflict. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't work narratively. And this is where I guess some people might freak out when I say this, but none of the things they do to define her is a problem until you put the whole package together. But when you look at it holistically, the way they present
present her is a problem. So, for instance, her haircut, you mentioned that. Well, I love a short haircut on my wife. In fact, she likes her hair longer, but I'm regularly begging her to cut her hair short because I think it highlights just how pretty her face is. But traditionally, long hair for women, short hair for men, right? So they put Carol in a short haircut. Why? Well, because it looks fierce and it looks provocative. Why does it look fierce and provocative? Because we're used to seeing that particular haircut on men, and it's off-putting to see it on a woman. When we go to the funeral home, who's like standing guard over the whole thing? Carol, with, attitude radiating off her. Does she have to be in dresses in pink? No, but she's in a masculine cut pantsuit. And you look at that and you go, guys, again, none of these problems are an issue in and of themselves, but when you look at it holistically, you've taken all these traditional features of masculinity and used them to say, look at how powerful this woman is. That's not elevating femininity. It's denigrating it and aping masculinity as if that's the only way a woman can be unique and powerful. It drives me crazy. There's much more interesting stuff you can do to present this woman as a powerful character. In fact, I know I'm on my soapbox. I'm about to climb off. But what they did with Carol Danvers in the comic books from the time she became an Avenger around the time of Secret War is much more interesting and speaks about her as a powerful woman much more robustly, even from like a secular perspective than what they've done in the comic book movies. It's crazy.
Amen and amen.
I'll tell you, the person who hates this most in my life is my wife. It makes her blood boil when we see stuff like Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman. She'll be like, my daughter wants to go see it. And she's like, I guess we can take her to see it, but I just hate for her to think that this is what she's supposed to look up to as a woman. And I don't think my wife is wrong. We didn't take my daughter to see, I've got two. One of them is old enough to be interested in these things. I didn't take my daughter to see Captain Marvel, and I'm not sure what I'll do with, what I'll do when it comes out on video. And also, I don't know what we'll do with Infinity War either. Or not Infinity War, Endgame. Well, okay, man. I guess the question left is, how do we think about the gospel with this movie? So how do we enjoy the gospel thinking about Endgame? And then also, how do we talk to our neighbors about the gospel through this movie?
We need someone who is morally perfect, who can fulfill God's perfect moral law. And that's what we have in Christ. He is God the Son incarnate. Only He can truly save us. And he has given his life selflessly for the church. But unlike Tony Stark, right? So Tony gave his life, but he's still in the grave, and Christ conquered death. So he can continue to rule and reign. And so there's superhero movies, right? There's no glorified existence where there's no more evil or there's no more threat. And part of that's just the stories, right? There's no everybody lived happily ever after, because there's going to be someone else come and they're going to still have to fight. But with Christ, when he sets all things right, it's right forever. And I'm thankful for that reality, man. And so that's how the gospel, I think, applies. And the way that I would talk to my neighbor or an unbeliever about this movie is I would just point out the virtuous things, and ask them particularly about, the selflessness of Stark and how that fits in their particular worldview. I don't think that selflessness fits with a naturalistic worldview, or atheism. I don't think it's consistent with those things, and so I would encourage them to see if they value that, and if they do, why do they value it? Because if the goal is survival, right, it would be foolish. And I mean, even in that movie, you would have an opportunity to talk about. If the goal of naturalism is the survival of the human race and we want the planet to last longer, then perhaps Thanos had a good idea. And so you could talk about that. And I don't know, those are the things I think I would emphasize, though, depending on the worldview of the person I was talking to. Most people will value what Stark did in this movie. And they do that because they long for, they believe that man is made in God's image. They may suppress this truth, but they believe that. They at least believe they are valuable.
Yeah.
And so believing that, they see humanity is valuable enough to be saved. And then 2, they long for salvation. They long for a right relationship with God, an answer to the sinfulness in their heart, the guilt. They know to do right and they don't do it. They long for that to be fixed. So I would try to focus on those things. And I think this movie gives you good fodder for that, right? It encourages that discussion because you have this self-sacrificing love to save, potentially all mankind.
Sure. I think that what Tony Stark does in this film is about as close as you can get in a superhero movie to Romans 5:10-11.
Okay.
While we were enemies of God, we were reconciled through the death of Christ, right? And Paul goes on to say, scarcely would someone die for their friends, but perhaps a good man might. But to lay down your life for your enemies is another thing entirely. And again, with what Tony Stark's doing on that battlefield, that's the closest we can get to that in a superhero movie. This is a guy who's giving up a future with his wife and child so that other people can live, not just his family, but even people that he'll never know. It's a powerful gospel image. It's an imperfect one, but it's still a powerful one. And I think it is bolstered by an even more clear one, which is Scarlett Johansson, her Black Widow, dying on behalf of Hawkeye or Ronan. They jockey back and forth. And basically the story with Clint is that he's become an evil man who uses his power to not seek justice, but to inflict vengeance upon wrongdoers, right? And that's because he lost his family. Well, they say in the moments right before one of them has to die, I think Hawkeye says to Black Widow, "Tell my family I said hi," and she says, "You tell them yourself." And eventually it works out where she dies so that he can go back to being the man he was before he fell. And so she dies in his place, hearkening to, if you want me to go full blown metaphor, she dies on a stone tablet, which sounds like C.S. Lewis and Aslan. But when we see Clint next, he is like on the backside of a baptism. He's laying in a pool of water, and the way that his hair is slicked back tells us that he has come up through those waters, and he's a new man. He's the kind of man who can go back home as a husband and a father. And I think both of those are powerful images of sacrifice on behalf of someone else, sacrifice that brings redemption and a restoration of all things. It's right there with Tony Stark and Natalia.
Natalia.
Isn't that her name? I know they call her Nat. It's Natalie or Natalia 1.
Oh, I have no idea, man. That's your world.
I think it's Natalia Romanoff. It could be Natalie, but I think it's Natalia.
Okay. That's good, though. You did good.
I did good. Thank you. Thanks for your endorsement.
I just didn't know who Natalia was.
All right, man. I guess that's all I got in the bag here. This is a great movie to geek out at, and I'm assuming everybody listening has seen it, but I don't think I've ever heard a theater come alive like I did when all the heroes started stepping through those portals to join the fight against Thanos.
It was crazy.
The top went off that place. The only thing I can compare it to is being at a sporting event.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's a great movie, and I think it rewards a lot of rewatches. I do have 2 final questions, okay?
Sure.
You tell me. Let's evaluate Tony Stark and Steve Rogers morally.
Okay.
So we see a weird scene at the end of the movie where Peter Parker goes back to school and he sees Ned there, right?
Yeah.
His buddy. And Ned hasn't aged. So we assume, I guess, that Ned was snapped out of existence too. But so what happens with Peter Parker? Everybody in his life is 5 years older now. And does he just go back to school as like a sophomore when all of his friends are starting college?
I guess.
And I'm guessing it means that, him and Ned just kind of pick up like they've been held back developmentally and educationally. We've got all that going on all across society, right? So like parents who watch their kids disappear, they're having their children walk back into their lives. There may be parents who like killed themselves because of the grief. I guess they stay dead, but the kid's back now. Think about like you watched your spouse get snapped out of existence. 5 years is a pretty long time. I'm not trying to tell anybody that it's an appropriate amount of time, but I'm sure there are some people who would move on to a new serious relationship within 5 years, right? Mm-hmm. So you got like, hey, I was married and now I'm married again, but my first spouse is back all of a sudden. So Tony, by insisting that the 5 years that have passed stay, has really put everybody in a difficult situation. Mm-hmm. Is it not much better for him to say, we just go back to to when Thanos snapped everybody out of existence and move on from there?
Yeah, I think that would be ideal. Or take his wife and daughter with him and go back.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? So I get that there's a whole set of problems on the other side, that Tony's not the only one who has had a kid since then or done something deeply meaningful. Mm-hmm. But it does seem really weird that this is the solution, considering all the negative consequences and what honors life. It does seem like just resetting the clock. And yeah, if you could kind of pull new humans born in those 5 years in with you, that seems like even that's a better solution than what he chose. Listener, you feel free to tell me why that's a problem. And some of them I can anticipate. So like a baby who's born right before Tony snaps his fingers may go back to a world where his parents are still teenagers and unable and unwilling to care for him. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But it just causes a lot of problems. And Tony makes that decision unilaterally. He shows up and says, this is how it has to be. So if you're going to evaluate him morally without the burden of having to propose a better plan, do you think he acted as wisely as possible?
Not as wisely as possible, no. I mean, I think you'd have to do just war theory just in reverse. Or, like how many folks are going to be saved? Like, if you've got to lose people, how many do you have to lose? We're talking objectively, but I don't know. They couldn't just him haul around either.
Right. Well, then also with Steve, which again, I say this as a guy who I'm just willing to punt on those big questions and say, this is a really well done movie and I don't need it to make perfect metaphysical sense. Mm-hmm. But Steve decides to go live his life with Margaret Carter back in the 50s or whatever. Mm-hmm. But are we supposed to assume that he sat out, world wars and supervillains showing up and, all the craziness that has happened over the course of, from 1950 to 2019? Was he really just hanging out in that house dancing with his wife when he's a super soldier?
That's a good question. Now, I didn't even think of that.
Here's the thing. If he decides to retire, I think soldiers get the option to retire. Mm-hmm. But it just seems weird. Like, it seems weird that the world would go through what the world went through in that time span and him just be there in suburbia, which is not necessarily required of the way the movie ends, but it's strongly implied. He got married, they had a life together, and I guess there's a world where like he's the second Captain America of that world. Like eventually that Captain America is thawed out and goes and does some stuff, but still all the years that other Captain America is in the ice, what's Steve doing?
That's a good question. That's so Tony is selfless and then Captain America is selfish.
I mean, I haven't seen it, but I'm sure there are people on the internet right now arguing that.
That's interesting. Yeah. So the reason why Tony wouldn't get in the fight is because he wanted to keep his family, and the reason why Captain America
leaves the fight
for good. It's interesting.
Yeah. The only other question I've got coming out of this is not really a storyline question, but in the comic books, at some point, Captain America is assassinated, which we think he just dies. What actually happens to him is he gets lost in time. So it's very, it's comparable to what happened in this movie. Mm-hmm. But while he's lost in time, Bucky takes up the Captain America mantle and carries the shield and functions as Captain America. Mm-hmm. Then eventually, Steve comes back, but he doesn't resume his activities as Captain America, and Sam, who is the Falcon, takes over as Captain America. I like the entire storyline. Like, Steve Rogers will always be Captain America, but if you're going to take a little time for somebody else to do it, it's Bucky and Sam that should do it. But it seems like they just jumped over Bucky being Captain America in this one. Mm-hmm. And I'm just frustrated by that. It may be political because they want to quickly get to a person of color holding the shield. Mm-hmm. And that's their character. They can make that choice choice if they want to. I'm not going to criticize them. But man, the Bucky stories as Captain America, like a guy who felt the shame of his past pulling him, while at the same time the living up to the ideal of Captain America as Steve embodied it, make for some really good stories. And we've got Sebastian Stan right there. He's signed to a bunch of Marvel movies still. I just wish I wish there was better hope that we got a run with him as Captain America and then Sam, but it doesn't look like that's to be. I said I was done a minute ago. I'm actually done now. We're going to put a bow on this one. Thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging with us with a special long episode of Pop Culture Coram Deo. Before we get out of here, Jared, where can listeners find you outside of the world of this podcast?
You can find me on Twitter at Jared H. Moore. You can find me on Facebook at All Truth is God's Truth. We've got another podcast called All Truth is God's Truth. Check it out. And you can find Jeff and I on, we're writing some for Monergism's blog. Jeff has a review of The Conjuring 2 on Film Fisher.
Yeah, and I hope to get a piece up on The Curse of La Llorona very soon.
Oh, great. Check us out.
100%. I'm at Right Jeff on most social media platforms. You can connect with anything I'm doing through that, and I would love indeed to connect with you. We would appreciate you guys reaching out in whatever way is convenient for you. Specifically, if you'd be willing to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, we would so appreciate that. You say, you know what, I can't in good faith give you a 5-star review. Cool, we're not offended. Give us a review that you can feel good about, whatever star rating you want to. We'll take it. We want to learn from that, see how we can best cater this podcast to the needs of the church, and those reviews help us do that. So if you got time and you're willing, we would much appreciate a review on whatever podcasting platform you make use of. Guys, until we are back with you on the next episode of the Pop Culture Coram Deo podcast, Jared and I want to encourage you to live every moment as if you are before the face of God, because you are. Talk to you next time.
I'm reading a ton of Augustine right now.
Oh, that's good.
And his views on concupiscence, cupidity, and libido, but particularly concupiscence is what I'm more focused on. And I'm arguing in the dissertation that he in his earlier writings argued that concupiscence, so evil desire or sinful desire, is not sin, is not morally culpable sin. And then in his later writings that he argued that it is. And then the Reformed tradition picked up his later writings, and the Roman Catholic tradition picked up his earlier writings. So Roman Catholicism today argues that concupiscence or sinful desire is not morally culpable sin, but the Reformed tradition argued that it is. And,
oh my, yeah, you're picking a fight there, buddy.
And so I'm trying to argue today on issues of same-sex attraction that folks who argue that same-sex attraction is not morally culpable sin are agreeing with the Roman Catholic view of
Augustine and human sexuality.
Yes, and then those who call it sin are following the Reformed tradition, or at least agreeing with the Reformed tradition. You go back to I'm going to go to the confessions, and then I'm going to go to the prominent authors and crafters of those confessions and look at some of their writings. And so I'm trying to make this case from Scripture, and then I'm going to wrestle with guys like Wesley Hill, Robert Gagnon, Matthew Lee Anderson, Mark Yarhouse, a lot of the guys who disagree with me that are kind of giants on this issue, and I'm going to wrestle with Denny Burke and Owen Strand and Wayne Grudem, Rosaria Butterfield. So it's been good for my soul, man. But I'm tired because of the Revoice conference is about to come up again, and just the arguments coming out of that are so sloppy biblically. I mean, they're all over the place. And they totally disagree with Scripture. It's more about empathy than it is about biblical fidelity, and
which distorts any empathy that we would draw, right? Like so,
right.
If your exposition isn't correct, then whatever empathy you source on your faulty exposition is going to be messed up too.
Yes, and I mean, we want to be empathetic the way that Jesus was, and according to Scripture. And so, and I don't know, man. It's like homosexuality is totally a different sin than anything else. Like, what I'm trying to say is we're all the same. If you have a desire that is contrary to the perfect moral law of God, that desire is sin, and you're morally culpable for it. I mean, who's the person that has same-sex attraction? It's the person person who has it. It's not like something is happening to you. You are the one who's having the attraction. It doesn't matter if you're consciously aware of choosing it or not. You're the one doing it. I mean, if you're not morally culpable for it, who is? And if you're not morally culpable for it, did God hold Jesus morally culpable for it on the cross? And if he didn't, I mean, we agree that we need a new nature, but yet for some reason we think that the sinfulness coming out of our nature is not something to repent of, or not something we're morally culpable for. But I'm going to get into that. That's one of the final chapters, is arguing that we need an ontological atonement. We need it. We need a new nature. We need Christ in his entirety, not just his moral actions credited to us. We need literally Christ credited to us.
Well, amen and amen on that.
I mean, so these fellas, that's what I don't understand. If you're not morally culpable for these things, well, did Jesus die for them? And if he died for them, why? Like, what penalty if there's no moral culpability, there's no need for penalty, right? Yeah. There's no need for punishment. But so anyway, I just think it's inconsistent across the board. And so I hope to wrestle with some of this stuff, and I don't know, man. I just hope it's beneficial to the church, because the church is all over the place. And the next thing that's around the corner is, the sexual revolution is not going to stop. It's going to keep revolting. And I think pedophilia, I think it's going to be the next thing that's pushed heavily. And I don't know how quick, but I can tell you just in 20 years that I can tell you in 5 years how much public homosexual sin has been justified. And if we lose this battle, and I think it's a battle for biblical fidelity on sexuality, sexual orientation, if we lose this battle, then you've lost it for every form of, or every sexual orientation under the sun. So anyway, I didn't mean to get into this, but I'm reading a lot of this stuff now, so it's in my head.
Yeah, I find that pretty interesting. So let me just throw a couple questions at you real quick.
Sure.
What do you say to the person who quotes James 1:14 and 15, right? You're tempted, enticed, then eventually desire turns into sin.
Yeah, I think the context there, James is primarily concerned in that book with actions. Faith without works is dead. And so the emphasis there is on actions. He does not say that the desire is not sin. He actually says that you tempt yourself, like you are the tempter. It's James 1:14 right. and 15.
Enticed by his own desire.
Yeah. And then I think it's a couple chapters later, he actually rebukes them for their sinful desire. Why is there warring among you? Among you? Why is there quarreling? You desire and do not have. Yes. So you murder. Yeah. And so he rebukes them for desire, just in the same book, And so I realize, folks, that's part of my dissertation as well, wrestling with that text. One of the most difficult things, though, man, is that I'm going to wrestle with is the temptation of Christ. Because James is talking about temptation from within, which Jesus never had. But are you really tempted if you don't desire whatever the object is?
So when Jesus is tempted to make a stone into bread, there has to be some desire for bread for that to be an authentic temptation?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's the thing. Does it have to be a desire for bread? Because that's what I'm leaning towards, is that desiring bread is not sinful, but desiring bread from Satan with all that he was arguing. And so my understanding of the temptation is that he could only – so Satan doesn't go to Jesus and try to tempt him with something that God has forbidden directly, right?
So maybe the thing in and of itself, like if he had tempted him to look at porn.
That wouldn't have tempted Jesus.
Do what? That would not have tempted Jesus, sure. Right. Because it is verboten.
Right. It's desiring something that is evil. So what he did was he took things that belonged to Jesus already, or were his right, that were coming in the future. He took the good things and tried to put himself in the place of God, as if Satan was Jesus' father instead of God. I'm just now wading into that, but my understanding is that he took good things. Like when he tries to get him to, the earth and everything is already his, or it will be. He's going to earn that.
A kingdom. It was like a shortcut to receiving his kingdom.
Right. And so desiring that kingdom is not wrong. So my understanding is that Jesus didn't have a sinful desire. He had desire for good things, but the devil tried to
weaponize it.
Yeah. Tried to. I guess I don't know what terminology I need to use, but anyway. So that's my understanding. And so there is a distinction. That's a big thing. Like, is there a distinction between temptation and desire? And yes, there is. And they want to look at Jesus and say, well, Jesus, if he was tempted, then he desired these things. Well, he didn't desire anything evil, or he would be a sinner, right? But anyway, so that's a good question, though. But that's the text that everybody brings up. Is James 1:14 and 15.
Sure. I appreciate you dealing with it. I've thought through this issue on much more of a lay level than you, but because of conversations about your work we've had off air. Also, in preaching through Galatians, you get to where I'm at now, 5:16 through 25. And, the 16 says, walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Mm-hmm. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. So there, the crisis point is at the desire level before you ever get to action. And mindful too of 2 Peter that talks about, Christians who have escaped the corruption of the world that is there because of sinful desire. And he describes also the last times and says that scoffers will come with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. And so I'm sympathetic to where you're at. I'm dealing with it as a pastor rather than a scholar. But I thought the James passage was relevant. So thanks for walking me through that.
Yeah. You bringing up Galatians, man. It's so my understanding is that when you're reborn, that now you still have the desires of the flesh, but you also have the desires of the Spirit, and you have a choice as a believer of who to submit your members to, if you will. Like you literally have the power to not. I don't think that you can, in this life, conquer your sinful desires, but it seems that you can potentially conquer your sinful actions, just like in Paul commanding that in Galatians, right, that we are to walk in the Spirit. So we need to be laboring to walk in the Spirit, to submit to the good desires that are in our heart now, because the Holy Spirit is there, and we've been regenerated and reborn. And it's interesting the way that, so Augustine takes Romans 7, and he argues that, we have this law of the flesh, and we've got the law of the Spirit. And when you submit to the flesh, when you submit to the flesh, you just encourage the flesh. Like it's never going to be satisfied. But when you reject it, and when you walk in the Spirit, when you repent, you basically starve it. And that's how sin doesn't reign in your life as a believer, is because of that. It's like that's how concupiscence goes away and is replaced with love, is by walking in the Spirit, or by, the more that you walk in the Spirit, the less sinful desires are there, if you will.
Sure. Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because those are the broad strokes by which I've been preaching the passage.
That's good.
The thing that follows 16 and 17 and 18 is a list of sinful actions, and then a list of virtues that are the fruits of the Spirit. And I take that to be Paul saying, lean into these desires, cultivate these desires for these things, starve the desires for these vices, and do it as a member of the redeemed community who knows confidently that what he says in 24, the flesh is crucified and the appropriate way to live is in step with the Spirit. So that's encouraging. I appreciate that. I'm glad to hear my congregation isn't suffering after terrible exegesis.
I'm sure you're doing a great job, brother. That's an awesome book.
Yeah, it is. It's rich. Okay, man. I guess we'll bring the update on your dissertation to a close, but I know for sure that I'm speaking on behalf of all our loyal listeners when I say that we're excited for the work you're doing, looking forward to hearing about its completion and seeing how it profits the church.
I appreciate it. Pray for me, folks, to persevere.
Absolutely.